With what is being deemed by many as the most interesting and most anticipated first-round matchup of the 2026 NBA playoffs between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Denver Nuggets, these two always put on an absolute show, and now, once again, we get to see it in the playoff stages. Hello everyone and welcome back to StepBack with Zach, and in today's video I'm going to be doing a preview of the Minnesota Timberwolves Denver Nuggets first round playoff series. Now, if you guys have been keeping up with either of these teams or just the NBA in general, you will know that the Denver Nuggets have actually won the season series 3-1, which you might be thinking straight off the bat that that's a pretty big gap. And that shows that the Denver Nuggets are clearly the superior team. However, the season series was actually a lot closer than you probably think. I need to sneeze, bro. The Denver Nuggets have averaged 125 points per game against Minnesota this season, while the Minnesota Timberwolves average 120.3 themselves. So less than a 5-point per game difference. And even if we look at the box scores for this season's matchup, it has been 127-114 win for Denver, 123-112 win for Denver, then the most electrifying game out of all of them, 142-138 overtime victory for Denver on Christmas, and then their most recent game was a 117-108 victory for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And then all their other stats are also pretty close as well. Denver has a 60.9% true shooting percentage, while Minnesota has a 59.2%. The rebounds are also fairly close. Minnesota is averaging just over 40 boards per game, while the Denver Nuggets are averaging 45.5. The assists are actually being won by the Minnesota Timberwolves, which is kind of surprising. Minnesota is averaging 26.5 assists compared to the Denver Nuggets 26.3, so it's still very, very, very close. And again, like I said, it has been so much closer than you guys have probably thought. Now, their first matchup of the season, Anthony Edwards did not play. Jamal Murray exploded. He had 43 points. Game 2, both sides kind of struggled offensively. Jamal Murray shot 9 for 22 from the field for 23 points. Jokic was still good. He shot 8 for 15 from the field. However, only 15 field goal attempts for Jokic is kind of underwhelming. He also put up 27 points and a triple-double performance again. Aaron Gordon and Tim Hardaway Jr. were really, really important for the Denver Nuggets in this win. They shot 9 for 12 from 3 combined. So without them, they probably would have lost this game, and Anthony Edwards really struggled for the Timberwolves in this game. He was 8 for 23 from the field and 0 for 8 from 3 for 26 points. But the third game of the season series on Christmas Day, that 142-138 overtime victory in favor of the Denver Nuggets, was backed by a 56-point, 16 rebound, and 15 assist monster. Absolutely insane triple-double from Nikola Jokic. Jamal Murray in this game also had 35 points on 9 made threes. Anthony Edwards for the Minnesota Timberwolves had 44 points himself in what was easily his best game in this season matchup so far, while Julius Randle also contributed 32 points. And then the final game of their matchup in the season, the one that the Timberwolves actually won, Jokic still went nuts, but everybody else on the Denver Nuggets struggled. They made less than 10 threes, which is very unlike Denver. Tim Hardaway Jr. himself was still pretty good. However, just very unlike Denver. And I think that is the game that Chris Finch should use as the blueprint of how to stop the Nuggets winning. Now, if we look at their recent playoff matches, they have faced off against each other twice in the 2020s. Once in 2023, which ultimately ended up in a 4-1 series win from Denver because the Minnesota Timberwolves, quite frankly, weren't on shit just quite yet. Anthony Edwards played really, really well, though. He averaged 32 points per game across the 5 games, and that was also the season that the Denver Nuggets went on to win the championship. And many people probably think, aside from maybe the Phoenix Suns, that the Minnesota Timberwolves actually gave the Denver Nuggets the most problems, as the Nuggets swept the Lakers in the Western Conference Finals, which was not really a surprise. But the Lakers still played pretty damn well, and then the Miami Heat in the NBA Finals got completely rinsed by the Denver Nuggets. So that showed a very, very promising thing for the Minnesota Timberwolves. But their matchup in 2024 was incredible. That was the series that we saw a blueprint on how to slow down Nikola Jokic. In the first 5 games of that series, Rudy Gobert was tasked with guarding Nikola Jokic, and Jokic went crazy. He averaged 30 points, 10 boards, and 9 assists on 54% from the field, leading his Denver Nuggets to a 3-2 series lead at that time. But Chris Finch made an adjustment in games 6 and 7 where he switched Karl-Anthony Towns onto Nikola Jokic. Still a big body, obviously nowhere near the defender that Gobert is, but big enough to make Jokic just work a little bit harder to post up, which ultimately meant that Rudy Gobert, who's one of the best rim protectors that the NBA has ever seen, allowed him to roam. And what it means when a player is roaming, it means that they can always be shifting back to the paint to protect it whenever a shot goes up inside, which is exactly what Rudy Gobert was doing. In this strategy, Nikola Jokic still scored well, however his efficiency dropped and his assists went way down. He averaged 28 points, 14 boards, which is very much carried by that 19 rebound performance in Game 7, and only 4.5 assists. Now again, the reason that this is so important is because having Rudy Gobert roam meant that cutters were not able to get as easy looks at the rim as when they had Rudy Gobert guarding Jokic. And this also meant that players were able to switch on the perimeter a lot easier onto Denver's open shooters, which meant that Nikola Jokic was not able to pass the ball and play make anywhere near as well as he is known to do. That was so important for the Minnesota Timberwolves' success in their 7-game series win against the Denver Nuggets back in 2024. Anthony Edwards was also really solid in this series. He averaged 28 points per game on 50% from the field, and that included 2 40-plus point games. Very solid performance from the Minnesota Timberwolves. And like I said, that was the key to success, was to put a bigger body onto Jokic, allowing Rudy Gobert to roam off of him and protect the paint, and which made it easier for the perimeter players like Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels. And I don't remember who the point guard was at the time. Was it Mike Conley? Probably. Whoever that other guy was, to just roam around and switch heavily on the perimeter. Do y'all remember that insane fadeaway that Rudy Gobert hit in Game 7? When the Minnesota Timberwolves were down, like, what was it, almost 20 points or 20 points? I don't remember exactly what it was, but that fadeaway was bonkers. That is the most crazy thing that I've ever seen Rudy Gobert do ever, and I actually jumped off my seat and I was like, what the hell was that, bro? That Rudy Gobert, or is that Dirk Nowitzki? Seriously, man, what a shot. And that Game 7, that 98-90 victory, like I said, where Minnesota came back down an awful amount of points. Like, it was close to 20. I don't know if it was north or south of 20, but it was an incredible comeback win for the Timberwolves. Now, I quickly want to go over some keys for success for both sides on how I think that they can win this series. I'm going to start with the favorite, the Denver Nuggets. Now, the Denver Nuggets obviously have an improved roster. They added really solid bench pieces in Tim Hardaway Jr., in Jonas Valanciunas. They brought back Bruce Brown. We've seen incredible internal development from Peyton Watson as well. But the biggest concern, however, with the Denver Nuggets is their lack of defense. And with this, going up against a premier scorer, in fact, the league's third leading scorer this year in Anthony Edwards, it is super important for them to try and slow down his self-creation as much as possible. Now, they're obviously not going to stop him because just like Jokic, he's a very good offensive player, but with their starting lineup and Christian Brown especially, it's going to be pretty damn difficult to actually slow down Anthony Edwards because they've only really got one reliable perimeter defender, being Christian Brown. I just don't think Christian Brown's going to be enough. And with this as well, if they throw so many bodies at Anthony Edwards, who, by the way, is 4th in the league in isolation points per game, like I said, if they throw bodies at Anthony Edwards, they are going to need to stop the other Minnesota Timberwolves players from raining down threes. The Minnesota Timberwolves are 6th in three-point field goal percentage this season. Now, the Minnesota Timberwolves do have some really good shooters, like a Dante DiVincenzo. Jaden McDaniels has improved a lot. Mike Conley can still hit some threes from time to time. Julius Randle is very streaky, so I'm not sure how that's going to work, but they've got Bones Highland off the bench, who's a great three-point shooter. Naz Reid can step out and give you 3 threes a game if he really wanted to. Ayo Dosunmu's no slouch there either. So the biggest thing I think is going to be for the Denver Nuggets to try and slow down Anthony Edwards as much as they can and just try to let the others beat you, because Aaron Gordon is going to be matched up against Julius Randle, and that is going to be a very, very physical matchup. That'll be fun to watch. Now, the Denver Nuggets have also been the best team in terms of converting their open three-point field goal looks across the entire association all season. But if Chris Finch deploys the same schemes that he did against the Denver Nuggets in that 2024 matchup in Games 6 and 7, it is going to be a lot harder for Jokic to create these open shots because of the swarming perimeter switch heavy defense of the Minnesota Timberwolves. So it is going to be super important that the Denver Nuggets supporting cast like Jamal Murray, I say Jamal Murray's a supporting cast, he is to Jokic, but also Cam Johnson, Christian Brown especially, it's going to be so important for them to actually hit their three-pointers. And going back to the defensive side of things just one more time, Minnesota is a very, very physical defense. Ant, J-Mac, Julius Randle, and Rudy Gobert sometimes can be really, really physical, especially Julius Randle. Can the Nuggets match the Minnesota Timberwolves' physicality? I don't know. Also, can the Nuggets stay at least neutral in the minutes that Jokic is not on the court? We know for a fact that the Denver Nuggets are historically way worse when Nikola Jokic is not on the court. And that is not surprising. Jokic is one of the best offensive players we've ever seen. Top 2, in my opinion. But if the Denver Nuggets build somewhat of a lead and Jokic needs to sit because he's tired, he's going to be being pushed around by Julius Randle and Rudy Gobert and Naz Reid from time to time a lot. He's going to get more tired. He's going to need to rest at some point. Can the Nuggets supporting cast at least remain a net neutral team? I think that is a huge question, and that will be so important if the Denver Nuggets want to win this series. And then the biggest thing for the Denver Nuggets specifically is their health. Lingering health issues all year. Every single important player for them has missed time. Aaron Gordon is still being affected by that hamstring. Now, he has looked way better, but he's still looking a step slow. And him having to guard Julius Randle, who is healthy, that's going to be a very, very big question heading into the first round series against the Minnesota Timberwolves is the Nuggets' health. Now I want to move on to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and in my opinion, they need to be better on defense, especially against the number 1 offense in the league in the Denver Nuggets. The Minnesota Timberwolves have been the 8th best defense in the entire NBA this whole year. However, they do not play the Nuggets well. All year, they have just looked a step slow. They just look like they aren't really trying. They give up the 3rd most points per game to the Denver Nuggets across all of their opponents this season. And that is a big, big problem because the Denver Nuggets are never going to beat you on the defensive side of the ball. They are always going to beat you on offense. And the fact that the Denver Nuggets have, let me just have a look here, scored over 120 points 3 out of their 4 matchups is not what you want if you were going to win a playoff series. Now, the playoffs are a different story. They slow down an awful lot, which is in favor of the Minnesota Timberwolves. But again, the Jokic factor of everything, the Nuggets are still going to be very, very good on offense. But the Minnesota Timberwolves need to lock up and lock in. Anthony Edwards as well is probably the biggest question coming into this series. Anthony Edwards has dealt with injuries. Anthony Edwards missed 10 out of the team's last 13 games, and he didn't play 30 minutes in any of those 3 games since coming back, and he has looked just way slower. Like, the game against Philadelphia, he played terribly, to be quite honest. It's probably the worst Anthony Edwards game I've seen ever. He scored 8 points on 3 for 15 shooting and 0 for 7 from 3. And then even in that matchup against the Houston Rockets in their penultimate game of the season, he only scored 22 points on 14 shots. He looks to be laboring. He doesn't look anywhere near as explosive as he is known to be. Can Anthony Edwards pick it up again in the playoffs? I definitely think so. Anthony Edwards is definitely a playoff riser, and he loves the spotlight. If there's anybody who I am confident in turning it up for the playoffs, it is Anthony Edwards. Now, in terms of the defensive side of the ball for the Minnesota Timberwolves, can they limit Denver's open three-point looks? Nikola Jokic is the best player probably ever when it comes to generating open shots for his team. That's never in question. That is always going to be the case with Nikola Jokic. But if the Minnesota Timberwolves can at least prevent just a few more open looks for the Denver Nuggets, especially behind that three-point line, this can be a huge recipe for success. And on top of this, they also need to make their three-pointers because the Minnesota Timberwolves have struggled all season shooting the three-point ball. If we look here on the season, the Minnesota Timberwolves have made 10 threes, then 10 threes, then 12 threes, then 14 threes against the Nuggets this season on, quite frankly, very, very bad efficiency. So they need to limit Denver's open three-point looks while making their open three-point looks. Ayo Dosunmu, Naz Reid, and Bones Highland are gonna be imperative coming off the bench for the Minnesota Timberwolves. The bench has been the biggest question for the Minnesota Timberwolves all season. We know that their bench is one of the weakest in the entire league. With that huge game from Terrence Shannon Jr., though, against the Houston Rockets recently, maybe that helps bolster him into the playoff rotation, but Ayo and Naz Reid especially are gonna need to play out of their minds. Because even though the Denver Nuggets depth is nothing to, go crazy about, like it's nothing special, it is definitely improved from what it was the last time that these two teams faced in the playoffs. And Jaden McDaniels as well is going to need to have an incredible defensive performance against Jamal Murray. If J-Mac can slow down Jamal Murray, great things for the Minnesota Timberwolves in my opinion. But ultimately, man, I'm so excited for this first round series. And in my opinion, this will be the most competitive first round series in the entire playoffs. These two teams have a history. They've had crazy and wild stories. Anthony Edwards versus Nikola Jokic is always a classic. It's always so good, especially that Christmas game. Wow. I do still think that the Denver Nuggets are gonna come out of that series, but I do think that the Minnesota Timberwolves have a chance as well if they stay healthy, if Anthony Edwards can ramp it up, and if they buy in a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball. But my prediction for this series is the Nuggets in 6 games. I have them winning in. I think it's going to be a competitive 6. I can see a couple games maybe being blowouts, but I think ultimately it is going to be competitive, and it can go either way. I think if the Timberwolves win, it is going to go to 7 games, but I think if the Nuggets win, it will go to 5 or 6. My ultimate prediction is, though, Denver Nuggets in 6 games. But that will be all from me for this video about my preview for the Minnesota Timberwolves Denver Nuggets first round series. Let me know who you guys think is going to come out of this series, and let me know which first round series you are most excited for. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate it. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.